welcome to iNext.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you?
Sure. So I'm James Taylor. I'm the CEO of Decision Management Solutions. And I work with clients who are trying to implement analytics, and particularly analytics in high volume, automated kinds of systems. So how do I make my analytics change the behavior of my automated information technology infrastructure?
Well, that's an interesting area. You must have really gotten into the DataRush session.
Yeah, no, DataRush is an interesting product. I mean, when you start looking at doing some of these analytics, one of the challenges is, well, how fast can I build them? How fast can I iterate them? How often can I update them? And that clearly really pushes you to, in most cases, large amounts of hardware. But the analytics market is exploding. Lots of companies that are much smaller are trying to do analytics these days. And of course that creates this demand, well, how do I run these analytic routines without spending a fortune on a bunch of hardware? And so DataRush is a really interesting product in that sense, in that it gives you this scalability and this ability to use the cores and all the rest of it. That's really going to make a difference to how much hardware you need to run some of these algorithms.
What are you getting out of the conference? How are you liking it?
The conference has been great. I've really enjoyed it, and it's been interesting for me. Some of the sessions are very much around DataRush, they're around analytics, they're on topics that I follow, and others have been more generally around the data integration technology, which to a large extent I sort of tend to take for granted when I'm not paying attention, because I'm focused on what the analytics are that you're going to build on top of this data infrastructure. But I was impressed by the cloud-based approach. I think not just for the folks who want to do cloud-based integration, because I think that's an important market, but also I think even if I'm a large company and all my integration is behind the firewall, the ability to use the cloud to manage all those disparate integrations I think is an enormously powerful concept. The fact that I can do it that way, it saves me having to hook up all my internal systems so they all share a common thing, and that moves data integration from a bunch of distributed scripts to this much more managed repository of data integration assets. I think that's the right direction for data integration as for many things. So that I think is an interesting development too. I enjoyed that one.
It could actually, to a certain extent, solve the problem you were just talking about before about needing a lot of compute power and not having a large budget to buy a lot of hardware.
For sure. I mean, it's clearly analytics in the cloud is still a little bit problematic because of the amount of data transfer involved. How do I move all this data to the cloud and do analytics in the cloud? But one of the big challenges for analytic models, once they're built, is, okay, I've got a model. How long will it take me to put it into production? And often it takes 6-9 months for IT departments to turn this model into something they can execute. And the big reason is that it's easy for an analytic modeler to suck data from lots of different systems and build their model. But when you want to run that model in a production environment, well, some IT group now has to hook up all those data sources to this production system. And so in that sense, I think the value of integration also comes on the deployment side of this. Once I've got a model, which I can now build faster because I can use DataRush, well then, okay, that's interesting, but it isn't useful until it changes the behavior of something. So the time it takes me to get to that deployment infrastructure is a really big and important issue. And so I think if you're using something like Pervasive's product set, then you've got a much quicker time to value with your analytics once they're built.
You've got to build the plumbing underneath.
You've got to build the plumbing. Right? Otherwise, you just have a model, you don't have any business value.
Mm-hmm. So is this going to relate in any way to something you're working on coming up, possibly?
I work with a lot of folks who are, they're analytic specialty shops who build custom applications for people. There's a lot of work around multiple analytic techniques being used in combination and a lot of research around that. I think there's some real potential for those guys to get the rapid deployment of, particularly of Python, which they seem to use a lot for prototyping, and to a lesser extent for Java, deployed onto these boxes using DataRush. So I think that continues to be an area of interest for me. But I think the cloud-based integration is also interesting, particularly the ability to mix the on-premise agents with the cloud-based integration, because I think for a lot of companies, deploying models is a big deal. I mean, that's a really big barrier to analytics success from the point of view of analytics, the way I talk about them. And so I think I'm going to have to think more about what that means for folks. And I'm already working with some companies that execute predictive models in the cloud and everything else, but you're still assuming that you can just pass all the data in through a web service. And I'm starting to think, well, what if you had an integration infrastructure in the cloud that's connected to this? Well, now maybe you don't need to pass the data in. Maybe that's something that you could manage with the data integration infrastructure. So there's some interesting noodling that I have to do around, well, how does this change what I tell people about deploying models? And I think it will change it. I think that ability to bring all those different data sources in and make it happen is really important.
Well, I'm glad we could get your brain jump-started there.
Well, it's always fun to have new things to think about, right? It's the great thing about software is there's always one more problem that needs a neat solution, and it's always nice to find another neat solution to add to that list of building blocks that you can work with.
All right. Well, thank you for coming.
Thanks very much. Thanks for
Nice
having me.
talking to you.
You too.
All right.